It was the moment that could have ruined her. Dan Harris, the billionaire real estate mogul, leaned back in his chair with an arrogant smirk, his expensive suit glinting under the chandelier light. His guests were laughing, hanging on to his every word, completely captivated by his status, his power. Angela Smith, a waitress at the Willard Intercontinental, stood frozen beside his table, pouring water. She was used to this, used to being invisible, a mere servant in a room full of important people. She had spent years perfecting the art of being unnoticed, a ghost among the living, just another face in a crowd of strangers. She was good at it. But then something went wrong. Dan Harris's elbow hit the water pitcher just as Angela was about to refill his glass, sending a few drops splashing onto his custom-tailored suit. The room went dead silent. Angela's heart skipped. It wasn't the first time she'd spilled something on someone, but this was different. This was him, the one person in the room who didn't see her as human, the one person who could make her life hell with a single word. "You really think you're better than me, don't you?" His voice sliced through the air, cold and dripping with disdain. Angela stood still. The pressure of the moment crushed down on her chest, but she didn't look away. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room on her. She could feel the weight of all the humiliation she'd ever experienced in her life pressing in. It would have been so easy to apologize and shrink away, to stay invisible. But tonight wasn't going to be like any other night. "You're just another uneducated servant, out of your league," Harris sneered, his voice rising, drawing the attention of every guest in the restaurant. The truth hit her like a cold wave. He thought she was nobody. He thought she was stupid. He thought she didn't matter. But what Dan Harris didn't know was that Angela Smith wasn't just a waitress. She was something more. And tonight, she was going to make sure he knew it.
Have you ever felt like you were invisible? Like no matter how hard you worked or how much you sacrificed, the world still overlooked you? Maybe you've been told you weren't good enough. Maybe you've had dreams, but they got crushed along the way. Well, stay with me, because tonight, everything changes. Sometimes the people who think they can break you are the ones who end up getting broken instead. The moment that would change everything came so unexpectedly, it felt like time slowed down. The waiter, James, a senior server, hurried toward Angela near the kitchen. He looked frantic, his face pale. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, using the name Angela had told him when she started working here. "I need you to cover Dan Harris's table for me. I spilled wine on my shirt, and I need to change. Just refill their glasses with water. Don't engage with them. Just be in and out, okay?" Angela's stomach churned. It was bad enough that she was invisible to most of the restaurant's high-end patrons, but Harris? She wasn't sure how she could avoid the chaos he always seemed to bring with him. But she had no choice. She nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay, I'll do it." Her heart pounded as she picked up the pitcher. She knew her job well enough to handle this. She had done this hundreds of times before. But there was something about Dan Harris that made her dread the moment she'd have to approach his table. As she walked across the dining room, the buzzing chatter of the high-powered guests felt distant. Her mind kept racing back to the conversation she overheard at the bar. Some people at the restaurant had been whispering about Harris's reputation, how he didn't just make money, he manipulated people, ruined lives, and walked away unscathed. And there she was, about to wait on him. Angela reached the table, her pulse racing. She was in the process of pouring water for the woman sitting beside Harris when it happened. His elbow shot out, knocking the pitcher from her hand, sending water splashing onto his jacket. Time froze. The entire room fell silent. What would you do if you were in her shoes? What if you knew that one mistake, one accident, could be the difference between keeping your job or losing it all? It's easy to shrink down, to apologize and hope for the best. But what if standing up was the only thing that could change everything? Keep watching, because tonight, Angela's life is about to take a turn she never saw coming. The water splashed across Dan Harris's sleeve, and for a moment everything seemed to pause. The fine linen of his jacket absorbed the water like a sponge, but the real damage wasn't to the fabric, it was to his ego, and from the look on his face, that was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. Harris's eyes locked onto Angela with a cold, calculating stare. The silence that followed felt like a heavy weight pressing on her chest. He didn't even blink. The laughter at the table had disappeared completely. The two men and the woman in expensive jewelry froze, awaiting Harris's next move. Angela's heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen. Her mind raced. Should she apologize again? Should she beg for his forgiveness? Should she simply turn around and walk away? The words seemed stuck in her throat. For the first time in 8 months, she felt the weight of every glance in the room settle on her. "Well?" Dan Harris's voice broke the silence, low and dangerous. "Are you just going to stand there like an idiot, or are you going to fix this?" Angela's fingers trembled, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The humiliation, the sheer injustice of what was happening held her in place. She had been invisible for so long, existing on the fringes of other people's lives. But now this man had forced her into the spotlight. It was as though he was deliberately shattering every boundary she had carefully built around herself. She cleared her throat, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll get something to clean it right away, sir." But that was only the beginning. Harris's voice grew louder, more venomous. "You know, I can't say I'm surprised. People like you, with your kind of job, are bound to mess things up. You wouldn't even be here if you had any real value, would you? I bet you didn't even finish high school." The room tensed. Every eye was now on Angela, the quiet waitress in a black dress, standing before a man who felt entitled to crush her spirit with his words. His friends at the table were awkwardly shifting in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. She was used to this, used to being treated like she didn't matter, but tonight felt different. Tonight, something inside her was awakening. The anger, the frustration, the years of quietly watching the world pass by. It was all coming to a boiling point. She started, but the words died on her lips. Harris's words hit her like punches. "What are you going to do? Cry about it? I bet you don't even know how to properly serve a drink, much less handle a conversation with someone who actually matters." For years, Angela had been pretending to be okay with disappearing into the background, pretending to be nothing. But she wasn't nothing, she was something, and Dan Harris had just reminded her of everything she had shoved into the back of her mind. The degree she earned, the languages she spoke, the skills she possessed, the life she left behind. Her voice finally broke free. "I didn't drop out of school," Angela said, her voice steady, clear. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since this whole ordeal had started. "I have 2 degrees, one in law, the other in nursing. I speak 5 languages fluently: Mandarin, French, Spanish, German, and English."
The shock in Harris's eyes was immediate. His face twisted with disbelief, as though he couldn't fathom what he was hearing. His friends at the table were now looking at her with a mix of confusion and curiosity. Angela didn't stop there. "You see, Dan Harris, you've made a lot of enemies. People think you're untouchable. You think you can intimidate people into silence with your money and your power, but the truth is, you're a criminal." The words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. What if the person you least expect, the one you've been trying to dismiss, humiliate, or put down, is actually the one with the power to bring everything you've built crashing down? Have you ever underestimated someone? What happens when you discover they were never who you thought they were? Keep watching to find out. Dan Harris's face flushed red, and for a moment he looked like he might leap out of his seat, but Angela didn't back down. She stood her ground, staring him down, the anger bubbling up inside her like molten lava, but tempered by cold precision. "What do you mean?" he spat, his voice rising. Angela took a breath, steadying herself. This wasn't the moment to flinch. This was the moment to take control. "You think your empire is built on strength, on power, on money, but the truth is it's built on lies, manipulation, and people like Robert Chin." She turned to the two men at the table. "You're about to sign a deal with someone who has ruined people's lives to get ahead. You're about to trust him with your money, your future. Let me tell you about Robert Chin, Mr. Harris's former business partner." The room grew silent again. Harris's guests sat up straighter, their attention shifting from him to Angela. 6 months ago, Robert Chin lost everything because of this man. Harris promised him 40% returns on a real estate deal and then used falsified documents to secure the deal. When Chin discovered the fraud, Harris had his lawyers threaten to expose his daughter's medical condition unless he stayed silent. The investors' faces were a picture of disbelief. They leaned in closer, drawn in by the weight of Angela's words. She turned to one of the investors and switched to Mandarin. "And you, Mr. Chen, the Shanghai deal, the numbers Harris showed you, he inflated them by 40%. The actual returns are barely half of what he promised you." The investor's eyes widened, his face stiffening as the truth sunk in. Angela continued, "I've been a lawyer for 5 years, specializing in corporate fraud. This man is a master manipulator, and what you don't know is that every piece of evidence is already in the hands of the authorities." Harris's face drained of color. He was no longer the powerful billionaire. He was a terrified man who had been exposed. The tables had turned. When you see the truth laid out in front of you, when everything you've been working for crumbles in seconds, how do you respond? What would you do if someone revealed all of your darkest secrets in front of everyone? It's not just about power, it's about truth, and truth always has a way of coming to light. "Enough!" Harris shouted, his voice shaking with fury. But Angela wasn't intimidated. She had been quiet for far too long. Now she was speaking with the clarity and power that came from knowing the truth. The entire room was watching, waiting for Harris's next move, but there was nothing left for him to do. His empire was crumbling, his secrets were exposed, and the people who had once idolized him were now questioning everything they had believed about him. Angela leaned in close to Harris, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he and his guests could hear. "You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to make me feel small, but you've forgotten something. You've forgotten that truth can't be buried forever. You've forgotten that people like me, people who don't matter to you, are the ones who can bring you down." Harris's lips trembled. His face was pale, drained of the color that once made him appear invincible. "You're done, Harris," Angela said coldly, standing tall now, "and the world is going to know what kind of man you really are." The investors stood up. Their minds were made up. "We're done here," one of them said, his voice crisp. The other investor shook his head in disgust, and both turned, walking out of the restaurant without a single word of farewell to Harris. Dan Harris's empire had collapsed before his eyes. Angela Smith, the waitress who had been invisible for so long, had become the one who had brought him to his knees. The world had seen her for the first time, and it would never forget her. As she walked out of the restaurant that night, Angela felt like a different person. The fear that had always gripped her heart, the fear of being exposed, the fear of not being good enough, had all melted away. She had done the right thing. She had used her voice, her knowledge, and her courage to stand up to a man who thought he was untouchable. As she stepped into the cool night air, Angela smiled to herself. She wasn't invisible anymore. Do you believe in the power of truth? Have you ever held your silence only to realize that the moment you speak, everything changes? Sometimes it only takes one person, one voice to shift the balance of power. What would you do if you had the chance to speak up? Remember, your truth matters. Let it be heard.